Welcome to the ISSA webinar for August 10th. Understand what matters. The new approach to assessing, quantifying, prioritizing, and reducing cybersecurity risks to the business. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Let us also thank SafeBreach for their generous support of the presentation. If you are not yet a member of ISSA International, please visit issa.org to learn more about the benefits of membership and join today. We'd like to encourage you to ask questions of our speakers. To ask a question, type your question in the questions area of your screen. We'll collect all questions for the open Q&A segment that follows the individual presentations. We'd also like to encourage you to share insights you hear on social media using the hashtag that you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner of your slides. After today's event, the presentation slides and a recorded version of the webcast will be available on the ISSA web conference page. You'll also be given the opportunity to print a viewing certificate on this webcast page on BrightTalk that you will be able to submit for continuing education credits such as CPE and CEUs in accordance with the various certifying bodies. I am pleased to introduce today's moderator, Alex Groman. Mr. Groman is founder of Secret Consulting and an ISSA fellow. He currently serves on the ISSA International Board of Directors and resides in Washington, D.C. Alex, if you'd like to begin the conference and introduce our guests, I'd be grateful. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've lost Alex on audio, so I'll go right ahead and take over a bit for him. So in his introductory comments, today's security teams navigate significant layers of complexity, contending with too many different standards and too many disparate technologies. The proliferation of technologies and terminology, in turn, generates a broader challenge, getting teams across the organization to speak plainly and generate consensus about risks to the business, all using common language. The reality is that too often there's a fundamental gap between the cybersecurity strategy and business goals and priorities that conspires against the success of each of these roles. At this point, I'd like to see if Alex is back with us. Can we hear you, Alex? So I'm going to go right ahead and introduce our presenters from SafeBreach. Yotam Ben Ezra, VP of Products, and Valery Lakin, Director of Product Management. Yotam is a cybersecurity veteran with more than a decade of product innovation and thought leadership in the security industry. Prior to joining SafeBreach, Yotam spent several years leading Radware's security product lines as the Director of Security Innovation, VP of Product Management, and Head of Security Research. Yotam holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics and Computer Science from King's College in London. Valery is an experienced product leader with more than a decade of experience in software development. He has strived to envision and create innovative products that improve efficiency and user experience. Valery holds an MBA degree in Business Administration and Management of High-Tech Companies from Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. Folks, we're looking forward to getting some of your questions. Please remember to post those in the questions area. And Yotam, I'll turn this over to you to start us out.
Thank you, Pam, and thanks, Alex. And thanks, ISSA, for having us today. I'm really excited to talk about the topic today. And we're going to go through it in several parts. So first of all, talk a little bit about the why. Why do we need to look at risk, and why do we need to reconcile business with security and different aspects of that. We'll then survey a few cyber risk models, which are pretty common, and then try to really talk about the challenge of how do we reconcile with varying levels of maturity in the organization. But let's start at the beginning. So basically, it comes down to three major topics that want to talk about the why and cause the necessity of being effective from a security strategy perspective. And the first one is the pace, and pretty much the pace of everything. So if you think about what does it mean that things are moving fast these days, think about digitization. So first of all, around 90% of companies have already adopted a digital-first business strategy. This means that practically there are more technologies and more devices that need to be secured, and the pace of change in this and the increase in basically the assets that we all need to manage and make sure we don't lose is increasing as well. Part of that is very closely aligned and attached to the cloud transition. So if we are thinking about the numbers, they're simply staggering from the market size of cloud security through to the fact that over 80% of workloads are already virtualized today. Over 85% of employers accelerated cloud adoption due to COVID because of the COVID impact. And so this all generates not only simply transferring existing applications to the cloud, but also cloud architectures and CI/CD practices, which predominantly are, they have a lot of advantages and of course help us all get to market faster and move things faster, but at the same time are more complex from an entity perspective and from basically the number of things that you have to manage. And then lastly, something which we all felt very heavily with the COVID, but actually started earlier, so remote workforce. A survey that I looked at by Zapier said that 2/3 of people believe that the office will be completely obsolete by 2030. De facto, during the pandemic, 62% of US employees work remotely. And so the variance and the variety of managed and unmanaged devices is simply growing. And so basically the pace of change and the pace of the way the environment is moving is basically something which is evident basically everywhere we look. On the other hand, which sort of also is very technological, things doesn't escape the attackers, right? So our threat landscape evolution is also accelerating. So we look at about a 400% increase in FBI complaints in the last year or so. Another aspect about the way the threat landscape is evolving is technology utilization. So we see more and more attackers using automation, using machine learning from the identification. Some examples of this is like to identify vulnerable targets in a smarter, more automated way, to use various automated methods like brute forcing at scale or scanning at scale in order to achieve more with less. What we have to remember is that after all, the threat market is also a market, and there is also things to be gained for the people which are basically practicing those activities, and they are becoming more and more efficient as well. And so if we look at another example, ransomware. So we had about 55 new ransomware families in 2020 only. And if you think about the number of variants, you get 2,000 very quickly. And so the threat landscape is evolving in a way which makes us think as security practitioners about relevance. It makes us understand that there is a great value in understanding exactly what we're trying to focus on. On top of that, there are internal constraints like budget limitations. And so one of the most evident aspects of this is what everyone is talking about for the past few years, but is only becoming more and more difficult, and is a talent shortage. So the cost and the utilization of security professionals. So I can tell you that not only that salaries are getting higher, but we work with a lot of security teams in our day-to-day, and the level of utilizations of those teams, these guys are so busy. And about 60% of organizations indicate that they have a cyber talent shortage. That's by University of San Diego survey that I looked at. 46% of employees in the cyberspace indicate that they are being contacted on a weekly basis by recruiters. That's only an indication of how limited the market is from a hiring perspective. And of course, there is a technology budget which is not infinite, and we have to make sure that we utilize it in the right way. So essentially, all of this ecosystem and all of those three aspects of our ecosystem make people understand that there is no 100% secure. So chasing the ability to be 100% secure from something or from everything, to secure everything from everything, is sort of an unachievable goal. And people are trying and starting to think about, okay, what's the right way to focus? And how can I focus in a way which brings value to the business I'm here to protect? And I think this is what brings the change in perception in a way that security managers and CISOs are basically required or are measured by their value generation to the business. So basically by how are they enabling and creating value for the business they are there to protect. And so at this point, I want to just stop before we go into the next stages and ask you people a little question. And we're going to launch it as a poll question, if I can get help with that, to launch the first poll, which is around, are you currently using any tools to measure or track your business or organizational risk? And we'll take a quick minute to look at that poll. So thanks for that. So we're getting something, starting to get answers. Please don't be shy. Please feel free to answer. We'll give it another 30 seconds. Numbers are changing here. Okay, things are moving. Thanks a lot, everyone, for participating. Right, so it's starting to stabilize, so we will move on. I will say that about half of you said yes, and about a quarter of you said no, and about 15% said I'm not sure, which is pretty much in line with what we see in our data. We can end the poll now. Thanks everyone for your insights. We'll be moving on to the next topic, and that's a little bit about what it means, right? So we've talked about the fact that we need to generate a focus, and we have basically two very different sets of data we want to generate, and I want to talk a little bit about the nature of this difference. And so we're talking about the security perspective versus the business perspective, and what are the aspects that each of those parts in the organization need to generate, and how we connect those layers. And so here I'll ask Valerie to talk a little bit about the security perspective and what is the focus when we are looking at understanding where we are from a security perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So if I'm thinking about the standard perspective of viewing on any security threat, it usually starts from and focuses on the security controls and the capabilities. So do we have the right security controls in place? Are existing security products effective? So can I rely on my EDR solution or my firewall, or even are they configured in the right manner, right? So there are a lot of misconfiguration going on in there. So first of all, I will focus on my security controls. And then the second question, or second type of question that I would ask is, what are the threats that I need to be concerned of, right? From the cybersecurity perspective, if I'm a financial organization, I will probably look at the threats that attack similar organization in my area. Or if I have a strong threat intelligence team that actually proactively searching for the threats that is relevant to my organization, I will ask them to get these answers. And lastly, another type of questions is what are the gaps and the different ways that I can explore the gaps with existing tools and some new capabilities that out there in the market. So to find out those misconfigurations, to find out what my security controls are actually capable of preventing. And a good example here would be taking the ransomware example, is that taking a look on the full kill chain of the latest ransomwares that are relevant to my organization, and kind of trying to break it down either by different layers of security that I have in an organization and try to score and tell how well I'm protected on different levels there, or taking into perspective the attacker view and see from the attacker perspective what is the infiltration phase, and focus on the infiltration phase and see that I can protect it, and then go on to the host level attacks, etc. So basically, I'm focused in the security perspective on what my security controls are capable of doing. And if someone gets and asks me a question, please, can you summarize it? Probably I would put in a bunch of scores, not one, not two, not three, but a bunch of scores based on different capabilities that I have within my security stack. And maybe if I invest more time, I will break it down by different types of threats and try to focus on that. So that would be probably my answer to the question. So am I secure against this or that, and how well I'm secure?
Thanks, Valerie. So there was a clarifying question from the previous slide regarding the number of malware families. So the number of new families is 55. That's not the total number of families for 2020. New families which were not known before. Okay, so we have our security perspective, but then the business side, the CFO, maybe the CEO, maybe the board of directors are asking themselves completely different questions. Things like, how exposed we are in financial terms. How much can we lose if something really bad happens? Or where should I invest in order to basically buy down that risk, or basically reduce that risk? And then they're also asking themselves around operational efficiencies. So how do I reduce cost, or how do I balance risk against a security budget? And another, and a very, very common question, we get that question a lot in terms of our conversations with CISOs, is how do I know that I'm getting the ROI on my previous investments? So what business does that investment enable, and how do I know that I'm getting the right results from or the right results aligned with my expectations. So if you go back to that ransomware example, that set of questions would be completely different. So what is the impact of a business disruption due to a ransomware, and then align that with the risk of what is the impact of paying the ransom? How much will that cost us, and what is the risk of that happening? How does that risk distribute across the organization? So how does it reflect for each of the business unit or the revenue generating engines that we have in the organization? And so if you think about those two perspectives, they are kind of like two people talking in different languages. So it's not trivial to answer the questions from the business with the data that we have on the security side, and what we need to build is basically that connecting layer. And that connecting layer is composed of basically understanding how business processes map to our technology stack, mapping our security stack to support those business processes, and then basically creating that connecting layer, which tells us what is the impact for a certain set of threats. Now that is predominantly considered a challenge or a heavy lift. There is always the question of, who needs to be involved? What data do we need to gather? How do we create an inventory of all our assets and map those? It's sort of, when you come to that in a straightforward way, it is represented as a big challenge. And so one of the questions we would like to talk about today is how to sort of reduce that challenge and still get some answers into those questions that we mentioned. I think at this point we might have a question. I don't know if we have Alex back. Alex, do we have you back with us? Right, so I'll just read out.
Well, I was going to go ahead
Okay.
and just sort of jump in here. So the question on the table is, so how can, Yotam, a security team effectively communicate the return on investment of their security tool or control the investment?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And I think the key to answering that question is answering the question regarding the connecting layer. So the idea is that once we have that connecting layer between the security data and the associated business perspective, then there are various ways where we can visualize this. There are various ways which we can quantify the answer, and hopefully we can talk about a few examples in the next slide. So thanks for that, Pam. We will now take a little pause to talk a little bit about more about different risk models and options to address risk, which are all very well known. I want to sort of share a little bit of statistics. So about a little bit less than 50% indicate that that's from the latest Harvard Business Review on that topic. So about 50% indicate that they either don't use or don't know which model is used in the organization. But about 50% do indicate that they use risk matrices. And so I want to stop there for a second and ask Valerie to give us a short overview of risk matrices and the principles there.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. So what is risk matrices for you that know? Just a reminder for you who do not use it at all. So basically a metrics that you can heat map your likelihood of exposure versus the impact that you're gonna get of a specific exposure. And the trick here is that you can apply it for anything you'd like. So it could be a threat that you choose. It could be a security control that you choose. It could be a business unit that you would like to focus on. So back to the ransomware example, if you would like to perform the assessment, and quantify the risk, you can apply the risk matrices module and this and calculate it based on your sales business unit and based on your production business unit, and if you're in manufacturing, based on your manufacturing. And it's a lot of manual work, so you need to actually involve a lot of work into mapping that. And also a lot of questions raise up, how do you quantify this likelihood and impact? So usually it's a score, like between 1 to 5, and you can think about different methods that you would apply to actually quantify it, but everyone chooses different methods. So there is no a standard that actually take use of that, and still it's a simple way to do that. So a lot of people do use risk matrices to try and quantify the risk, and it's a valid method.
Thanks, Valerie. Well, the next one, which is a lot less in use, but still the most popular model after matrices, so about 13% overall in organizations and about 17% in enterprises, use the fair risk model. So let's take a minute to explain about that.
Here's an interesting one, right? So for you that not familiar with FAIR, it's actually a really nice model that breaks down in the multiple levels the risk, and also breaks down by likelihood and impact. But it doesn't stop in there. It actually breaks down into additional level and goes beyond that. Breaking down the likelihood for different parameters, and breaking down the impact on different parameters. And then you kind of separating the external and internal information that you can gather from different sources, such as your threat intel platform, vulnerability management platform, etc. And you structure everything under the same model. Now, from one side, it's really interesting and structured way to think about it. From the other side, it's really complex to apply. And in most cases, when we try to kind of research about that, we saw that most of the things are more theoretical than practical. And the challenge here is actually to make it practical. And this is something that we'll also discuss further in this webinar.
Right. So at this point, I think we can launch the second poll question, which is around the models that we see here on the screen. And we are asking you to help us with how does your organization measure, quantify cyber risk? So if you have the knowledge of that, we would appreciate if you share it with us. That would be great. I will say that in terms of the next in line, so bow-tie methodologies and actuarial models are next in terms of popularity. So maybe you want to mention that, the probabilistic and the bow-tie methodologies, Valerie, while people are answering the poll.
Oh, yeah, sure. So probabilistic methods, they more statistical methods, taking into account historical data that you can buy or get by specific tools that provide you this information. Usually you would like to get some historical information relevant to your industry and organization, and then to apply various methods, statistical methods, to actually try and predict what is the potential of the or the likelihood of the attacks to your organization. And it's great because it takes into account a lot of information in history and a lot of parameters. However, it is missing the context of your specific internal capabilities of the organization. So those models are limited in this perspective. And the last one that you mentioned, Yotam, the bow tie, is it requires a lot of time. This is time consuming, and it requires speciality and deep knowledge of how to do that. Usually you would invite a consultant to actually perform this for your organization. And it means that you need to sit down to map a specific scenario. Let's take a ransomware again as an example. You need to break down all the phases of the attack. So you need to understand that. You need to break down the impact and potential consequences of each phase of the attack, and eventually to build up this big picture, which is consists of actions and consequences in really deep detail. So you cannot do that holistically for a lot of threats. You will need to focus here for a really specific threat to do this analysis for.
Excellent. So I think by looking at those different models, we get to a bottom line, and the bottom line is that these models have varying levels of details. They will have varying levels of justification from a mathematical perspective. And I think what it comes down to combining two things: the likelihood of some event happening and the impact of that event to the organizations. And I think there are several products as well which exist and offer solutions based on those models, right? So go ahead, Valerie.
Yeah, so I just looked on the poll results, wanted to kind of reflect it. It kind of represents some of the information that we got from the Gartner, the Harvard Business Review. The risk matrix is actually used around 60% of our attendees, and they do use other methods. So that's really interesting. There are probably some specific methods you guys using, and only 2% said that they're using actually FAIR model. And I do encourage you guys to take a look on that. It's really a comprehensive model. And even 20% answered that they do not measure anything. So the interesting question that I wanted to address here as well is that all of those models, or most of those models, require to provide some data, some inputs for the calculations, for the assessment. And as I mentioned, for risk matrices, you decide about what's the parameters and how do you score that. And for other methods, you may get it proposed by the tools, by the analysts that get to assess. But if you do not have the access to the data, it kind of garbage in, garbage out. So you can apply the method, but how practical it would be if you don't have enough information to feed in those models. And as any statistical or mathematical, or in this case, cybersecurity model it depends really hard on quality of information that you put in as input.
Yeah, so I think this is very much in line with a lot of conversations we've been having with CISOs about this topic, right? So the biggest question is how to make it practical. I see we're also getting questions like this here from someone in the webinar. So what are the technical requirements and what are the business requirements? Or the basic must-haves in order to get value from such a model, or basically, in other words, how to make it practical. So I think in the next batch or the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the basics of how to make it practical. What are the sources of the data that should feed into any of those models? And so, Valerie, I'll ask you at this point to take a quick stab at each of those components of a risk model.
Yes, thank you. So kind of reflecting this question about the technical requirements and must-haves, there is no single solution that actually can answer everything. So there is a bit of work that you will need to invest and do, and we will discuss also how deep you can go with the your investment and how effective it is actually to invest more effort to gather the information. But first, I would like to kind of clarify the bottom line that we mentioned from all the models. All of those models are built basically on two main components: likelihood and impact. And the difference is how do you calculate the likelihood and how you calculate or measure the impact, or how you define it. And eventually the formulas for calculation is different. But in order to a bit of abstract and make it more practical as well, is you can think about the likelihood as all of the security capabilities and all of the knowledge that you get from your security tools and your environment. And you can divide it into two sections mainly. So the first one is the probability of the event, of the threat event that would happen in your organization. And the main tool that you would use here to get this information is threat intelligence platforms and any threat intelligence source that you may have in your organization, which is relevant to your organization and can highlight the potential threat events in general or in a specific time range. And secondly, you know internally what are the most interesting assets or crown jewels within your organization for potential attackers. So if you're a financial organization, it's probably some data about your customers and credit cards. And if you're production or manufacturing, so those could be your production lines that might, something might go wrong there. And eventually you'll get an impact on that. So you know what are the crown jewels of your organization. And from the one side and from the other side, you can potentially get information externally, what is the latest threats out there. Now, in order to complete the picture of likelihood, you need also the probability of a successful threat action, which means what happens or how you know if a specific attack can happen to your organization. And here we have standard tools such as vulnerability management platforms that you can take a look on all your environments and measure which vulnerabilities you're exposed on, to take a look on the critical segments first, take a look on your exposed segments, and we have also emerging world of risk-based vulnerability management that brings in additional context and additional information. But that's kind of a static approach. To complement this static approach, there is a different set of tools under the security controls validation section, which actually tries to validate your controls, to validate the effectiveness of your controls. When you can simulate or run some attacks in your environment and see how your security controls behave, what do they trigger. Now, when you combine the threat event that comes in from the threat intelligence, let's say a ransomware that you want to focus on, and you know that it is relevant to your organization, now be able to understand which controls can block it or not is the core in answering, in getting the answer whether you are protected or not. So you would probably would like to, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted at this point to maybe ask our audience another question, and that's around their security hygiene and posture management. So let's launch the third poll if we can do that, and understand a little bit about how security hygiene and posture management budget is sourced in the organization, while we talk about the impact part.
Yes.
So perfect timing for a good question. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Alex, is it you?
I think I finally got in. The beauty of technology. So my apologies for everything about this, but let me jump in with a couple of questions. I've definitely had some thoughts myself. Now, most organizations are looking at this, and they're getting better about understanding, the risks and threats, the traditional models. But, there's always a good thought of like the less mature ones. They're really not getting that threat intelligence. I mean, threat intelligence seems to be one of the key terms that's been thrown out in the last couple of years. But I want to see if you can talk about how the mid-level companies, the ones that don't have the exorbitant budget, are really handling the threat intelligence in terms of, how they're measuring that, and because they're not always going to be able to see how effective the attacks are coming in versus their actual controls. But how do you see that from the mid-level companies or organizations in handling that? Kind of an open-ended question there.
Yeah. So I think a nice approach to that would be to use the MITRE ATT&CK framework in order to assess. So basically, MITRE ATT&CK framework can be used with the security control validation platform in order to map different threat actors and basically mapping TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures by attackers to threat actors and to sightings of threat actors can be definitely used as a source of intelligence to map those threats.
Yep, that's excellent. Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking towards that MITRE ATT&CK, and it's gaining quite a bit of traction, and it's a great service that they're putting out to the community. Thank you.
Definitely.
Are there any other questions, Alex?
I think that's the one. The MITRE ATT&CK one, I think, is really people getting to understand that. You know, the larger organizations, I think, adopted those, but the medium ones. But are you seeing a lot of the smaller companies being able to handle that MITRE ATT&CK? Because you're looking at, understanding the TTPs, it's a little bit heavy. It's a little bit tough. It's almost like you would need a full-time position. But what are you seeing in terms of the people that you interact with and their ability to adopt the ATT&CK framework? Is it coming on strong, or has it still got a long way to go? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think organizations are more and more starting to build their security program in line with the MITRE ATT&CK framework because it just provided us as an industry a common language to talk about generic techniques and procedures of attackers. And I think the nice thing about it is that a lot of us vendors have adopted it. And so you don't really need to be very savvy with the MITRE ATT&CK framework if your security controls or security control validation platforms are already referencing and basically providing templates and the pre-built scenarios to match that framework.
Right, and we spoke about like common language, continuing this topic of common language. I think MITRE is really creating here a common language both for security vendors and the threat intelligence teams, and to actually be able to validate everything and report on the same words. Right. So
right.
Do you have the answers for the poll, Yotam?
Let me take a look. Hold on. Yeah, so the question was, which of the following does security hygiene and posture budget comes from? So the 25% said the dedicated budget for that, which is great news. And then about 30% IT budget, then about 20% from a separate vulnerability management budget, and then about 20% said that they use funds from several different budgets to fund whatever is needed. Right. So thanks for that. But what it means is that most of the people we're talking to today basically have a budget for security hygiene and posture management, which is great. Let's talk about the other side of the equation, which is the impact. So how do I map out, or how do I understand the different components of the impact of a loss event?
Yes, so I will start from the first bullet here. So like you heard before, I mentioned that the likelihood is really easy to measure because you have probably the tools, or you have someone that helps you to actually get the answers. Either it's a VM tool or security validation tool, threat intel. You get the answers, then you put it all together, and you have this left-hand side. Now, for the right-hand side, for impact, it's a bit more trickier. But let's start from the simple one. So once you have idea about what your security controls can do, now you want to combine the business mind. But before getting in there, as we mentioned, there are some connecting questions. And you need to understand what are the loss events, potential loss events to the organization that might happen if a specific threat or threat family will attack you. So you can define what will happen if there is a data leak, or if there is a corruption of data, or service disruption, and how important it is to your organization. Now, here is a tricky point of how to define the consequences. And I think, Yotam, I will ask you here a question. What do you think about the consequences part? You mentioned that before.
So I think there are several ways, and I think one of the major aspects here is that talking to various organizations, and specifically, Alex, towards what you said, talking to various levels of maturity from an organization perspective. Not all organizations will have the same level of data available. That shouldn't take away from the value that they can get if they start looking at their business risk tomorrow morning. And so what we think is that we want to propose basically a gradual way at a varying level of detail in order to start looking at business risk from a high-level perspective and basically building the maturity of the risk program. And so when we look at the impact and the business consequences, we can basically look at three types of detail, or three levels of detail. We can start with what we call matrix-based consequences, right? People are using already, we saw that over 50% of the people we are talking to are using risk matrices. On the business consequence side, if you want to get a comparative value and a prioritization-based value of loss events, so you can basically generate the data using posture management, using security control validation, matching threat intelligence with that, and then basically assigning different priorities to each business unit in the sense of a high, medium, low, or a 1 to 5. So one side of the equation is based on quantitative analysis, data of your security effectiveness. The business impact is not yet there, but it is measured or shown in the sense of the business priority. So when you start visualizing your security effectiveness, you measure that and you visualize that in the context of what it means to the business. And I think that most of the security teams we talk to today are aware of where the business is going, what the business is doing, what business units are critical to the business, and what are medium from a criticality perspective. And so once you get there, you can basically generate a graph which says those are the most likely scenarios based on what we measured, and this is how they match from a criticality perspective. So basically what you're getting is a relative risk map. The second one is associated with relative consequences. So in order to get there, you can basically assign a relative importance or actual value based on a severity of a loss event, or the importance or the total revenue of a business unit or a business value. So if we think of a quick example, we all like chocolate. So I thought about Mondelez, which can map out, you know, the Oreo business unit and the Philadelphia cheese business unit to their relevant infrastructure, and then assess the risk based on that, and relate the associated revenue of those business units. And so the sample questions you would answer there are, you know, what is the riskiest business unit? What is the relevant risk of that business unit? And somebody jumping us to the questions. We'll get there in a minute. And then
someone's jumping the gun to the questions.
Yeah, someone's jumping aside to the questions. So then the last, or basically the holy grail, is to get to an absolute value. And for that, we can also do that in varying levels of detail. So you could go bottom up and start mapping out all of the data assets and all of the different components and so on, and that is definitely a heavy lift. What we're offering here is basically to go top down, estimate the loss value on a per scenario or per event perspective. So if we think of an example, ransomware business disruption of 3 days to the Oreo business unit means X to us, and then it basically makes the chunk to buy it much smaller. So here we will get to answers which are around what is the dollar value I'm getting from, or I'm risking based on not protecting from a specific scenario, or what is the value I'm getting from a security control. The idea is that if we start at the top, if we even start at the matrix-based consequence, but look at the likelihood perspective from a data-driven perspective, we are likely to gain more traction in the organization, pull more people in, and basically get data communicated across the organization. We will get more access to the details we are looking for. And so basically, to summarize, where we are trying to get here is how to make the notion of looking at our cyber risk in a practical way. And so, Valeria, I'll let you talk about the different stages and the components, starting from the likelihood through the impact, and then getting the risk out of that.
Yeah, so I did see there are a few questions. I will leave that to the end, hopefully get into them. So I just wanted to really summarize and make it even more practical here. So what we learn is the first step that you need to do is actually focus on what you want to assess, right? So you want to be focused on either a threat. It could be a specific threat, like a specific ransomware, or it could be a threat group like Fin7, for example, if you're a financial institution, or you would like to actually focus on your asset. Like if you have a really, really specific crown jewel in your organization and it's located in one or few locations, you would like to focus on that and then explore all the related different threats around that asset that it can harm you. Or the other option is actually, which is more relevant to your business units, is to focus on the business unit and again take a look on the relevant potential attacks that for those business units. And how do you get this information? So first of all, as we mentioned, you can go to threat intelligence, either threat intel team or threat intel tool that you may be using, and try to select those specific threats that you want to test and assess against. And of course, if you do not have this information, get additional stakeholders to the table and map your crown jewels, which is more critical and most critical to your business processes. So for an example, let's take Fin7. We know that Fin7 is all about stealing information for financial institutions, and one of their known tools they are using, and MITRE also helps to map those tools for different threat groups, is Carbonite. So if you want to go and assess and focus, first of all, you would like to choose those APTs and break it down by the capabilities, such as tools they're using, vulnerabilities they're usually exploiting. Once you have this baseline in place, the next levels are easier. So the next level will be get this information and make it measurable. So you can go and see what is your vulnerability management tools telling about this threat scenario, or going and running simulations in your environment and see how security controls behave, and maybe you need to update configuration or update your actual signatures to be protected well. And this is how you can score your organization posture versus a specific threat, or a specific posture against a specific set of attacks against your asset. And finally, once you have defined your loss events that are relevant to your organization, and it doesn't really matter if you start as simple as high, medium, low, or you go as detailed as a dollar value estimations, eventually you can overlay this information over the likelihood and get a visualization. You can get a visualization of the impact definitions, of the risk analysis that you perform. And this is something that you can actually go to your even board of directors and say, hey, our potential impact is A, B, C, D, and we have a gap of this amount of dollars, if you're able to map that to dollars, and we need to invest this and this money to buy or complement different security controls that are not behaving well, or we are missing them. Okay, so this is something that
just to add here, I think to make sure that we are clear. So basically, there are tools out there which will do this mapping for you, and will basically map those techniques into validations, and basically be able to generate that likelihood analysis and that quantitative analysis to give you the left side on the previous slide, the likelihood size, very quantified way across the organization. So that is important to note, that an organization needs to do that themselves and run the attacks manually in order to do this validation. Right, I think we have a few minutes. Thanks also for that, Larry. I think we have a few minutes for questions, Alex?
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end here. We're going to try and wrap it up and give it a little minute. But, this is an excellent presentation, and we thank you. This is a wealth of information and knowledge. Now, with some of this, these as organizations start moving towards these different these tenets that you're talking about, there has been the elephant in the room of how things are impacted now by COVID. Now, COVID is one thing that's really kind of thrown everybody for a loop, because you've gone on this trajectory like, hey, we're trying to get much more mature in our program, and then COVID hits, And then plus, we were already getting impacted by everything moving to the cloud. But now you almost have the double whammy of being more reliant on so many of your applications being on cloud, so much moving towards there. And now with a fully remote workforce that you really don't have even less of the perimeter as the perimeter we used to think about in the 1990s and 80s, it's really just thrown things on its head. And I want to get your comments on how do you see some of this and how it's evolving with COVID, and then also obviously moving to the cloud.
Yeah, so thanks. First, I will say that all of these things are all the more reason to be focused and to be effective from a security program perspective, right? And so they are even more calling us to basically look at how is our risk distributed across the organization. Now, if you look at COVID, for example, one of the things we've done when COVID hit, actually very quickly, was to define the notion of remote workforce as a threat scenario because of things moving so much. And so many customers were interested in understanding their basically updated risk posture, right? Because things have moved so much, and suddenly the entire organization became remote, non-integrated entities needed to get laptops, people needed to start working from home, and so on, and people needed to stand up VPNs very quickly, and so on and so on. So we basically defined that as another threat scenario to look at. On the cloud perspective, I think what we need to make sure is that the tools that we are using in order to support our hygiene, posture, effectiveness measurements are able to basically support those updated environments and have the capabilities in order to support us across the transition, across the cloud infrastructure, and so on.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you. And I think we're almost out of time, so let me turn this over to Pam so we can get this going. Pam, gentlemen, thank you so much.
Just one thing that I wanted to add
and great to have you with us for the second half. So thanks,
guys. One thing I wanted to add up here is that if you would like to learn more about quantification tools and methods, there are really good sources within NIST frameworks and Gartner frameworks that have a lot of information about that. So for those who would like to drill in and get more info, you're welcome there.
Perfect. Thank you. Pam?
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you, Alex. And gentlemen, thank you very, very much. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And again, thank you to SafeBreach for their generous support of the presentation. As a reminder, after today's event, the presentation slides and a recorded version of the webcast will be available on the ISSA web conference page. You'll also be able to print a viewing certificate on the webcast page on Bright Talk that you'd be able to submit for continuing education credits such as CPE and CEUs in accordance with the various certifying bodies. If you do have any questions, please contact us at memberservices@issa.org. You are also invited to join us tomorrow, August 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next webinar, where our topic will be Defend Your Financial Services Organization Against Sophisticated Fraud. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.